When Henry VIII's wife died, he made plans to marry Joanna of Naples. He sent his advisors to meet her, only to suddenly change his mind. But his letters revealed the chilling reason for his disappointment. The Tudors were some of the most compelling, powerful, and disturbing monarchs in history. The father of the Tudor dynasty turned England into a powerhouse, but his failings as a father created a monster. Where did it all go wrong? Let's find out. Henry VII's birth was a tragic and harrowing affair. His mother was only 13 years old at the time. The labor was excruciatingly difficult on Margaret's young frame. She barely survived, and the ordeal left her unable to bear any more children. But her pain wasn't only physical. A terrible tragedy made the experience so much harder to bear. Henry VIII came into the world as the Wars of the Roses raged, and the conflict started taking things from him before he was even born. His father, Edmund Tutter, fought for the House of Lancaster against the rival House of York. The Yorkists captured him not long after Margaret became pregnant, and he caught the plague and died in captivity soon after that. Henry VIII never knew his father, but his father's scandalous origins still had a huge effect on his life. The Tudors were an unknown family from Wales for most of their history. That all changed when Owen Tudor, whose bravery and battle earned him a place in court as a squire to King Henry V. He must have been quite the catch, because after Henry V passed, Owen had an affair with the Queen herself. Some even claimed the pair married in secret. Owen and Catherine had a son, Edmund Tutter. The father, Henry VIII, never knew. But when it comes to Henry VIII's twisted family tree, this is just the beginning. At Henry VIII's birth, if you'd have said that he'd be king one day, they would have laughed you out of the room. His regal grandmother aside, Henry had a laughably weak claim to the throne. His only direct connection to the royal line of succession came from Edward III, who was his great-great-great-grandfather. So, how the heck did this nobody become the King of England, founding one of the most legendary families to ever hold the throne? Henry V wasn't the only Tudor who knew how to get things done. Henry V likely wouldn't have even survived his childhood, were it not for his uncle, Jasper Tudor. Jasper took it upon himself to protect his brother's 13-year-old widow and their infant son. Tudor brought them to a seat at Pembroke Castle, where Henry spent the early part of his life. However, it was only a matter of time before the chaos that engulfed England reached their doorstep. Wars tend to have winners and losers, and by 1461 it sure seemed like Henry's side with the losers. Edward IV captured the mad king Henry VI and claimed the throne for himself. The news must have shaken Henry and his mother, but it was going to get even worse. With this New Yorkist king, men who'd fought for the Lancasters started fleeing England for their lives. Men like Jasper Tutter, he ran away to France, abandoning young Henry and his mother to their fates. If Henry got to enjoy a few years of peaceful childhood, all that was over now. A Yorkist earl by the name of Black William Herbert took over Pembroke Castle, keeping Henry there as little more than a hostage. There aren't many records of Henry's time under Black William, but as a Lancastrian with royal blood in his veins, Henry was in great danger. The New Yorkist rulers might decide to wipe out the Lancastrian line completely, and that would include young Henry Tudor. But here's the thing about the Wars of the Roses. Fortunes changed fast, and Henry's roller coaster ride was just beginning. The infamous King Henry VIII grew up in the lap of luxury. His father couldn't have had it any more different. He spent 8 long years living under the enemy, never quite feeling safe or secure. By 1469, he was 12 years old and had known nothing but captivity. Well, his suffering was near its end. William Herbert was called to battle where he was captured by Lancastrian forces and executed. The tides were beginning to turn for Henry V, and life was about to get even better. The pendulum swung back to the House of Lancaster, And in 1470, Richard Neville, the kingmaker, managed to defeat Edward IV and put Henry VI back on the throne. Henry's uncle Jasper came back from exile and even brought Henry to live at court with him. After such a miserable childhood, things were finally looking up for little Hank. Then, in the blink of an eye, it all fell apart. Henry VI's second stint on the throne lasted all of 6 months. Just like that, Edward III came storming back to England, wiped the floor at the House of Lancaster, slew the kingmaker in battle, and took back the throne. Henry's mother, Margaret, witnessed all of this happening and saw the writing on the wall. So, she made a heartbreaking decision. If Henry had felt alone at Pembroke Castle, that was nothing compared to what came next. Margaret Beaufort expected great things from her son, and she knew that he wouldn't get anywhere trembling beneath a Yorkist king in England. When she realized that her brother-in-law Jasper was going to flee France yet again, she begged him to take young Henry with him. There, Jasper could give him the upbringing she couldn't while trapped in England. In a devastating partying, Henry bid farewell to his young mother, unaware that he wouldn't see her face again for 14 long years. Jasper took Henry to Brittany, where they lived under the protection of Duke Francis II. Francis felt little love for King Edward IV and protected Henry along with several other Lancastrian exiles. It sure beat living under Black William back at Pembroke Castle. At least it did for a while. After 5 years, Francis fell ill. His advisers took over, and they saw Henry and the other Lancastrians as a big fat bargaining chip. Henry was about to be thrown back into the fire. Francis's advisers wanted to get into Edward IV's good books, and what better way than to hand over a bunch of Lancastrian exiles? His 5 years of freedom were officially over. Or were they? You see, Henry was a man now. He had a few devious tricks up his sleeve. The English envoys were preparing to set sail with their Lancastrian captive when Henry suddenly clutched at his stomach in pain. He cried out about excruciating cramps and buckled over. His confused captors gave him time to recover, but by the time he was better, the tide had gone out and they'd missed their chance to sail. Of course, the cramps had been a ruse to buy Henry time. He still needed a miracle to save his skin, though. Thankfully, one was coming. One of Henry's friends, a young Breton noble, arrived and announced that Duke Francis had recovered and that the deal was off. The English envoys didn't plan on listening, but in confusion of the noble Jean's arrival, Henry had snuck away from his captives and claimed sanctuary in a monastery. There he remained until the English were forced to board their ships and sail back across the Channel. Henry VII remained free to live and fight another day. And it's a good thing, too. Pretty soon, the entire House of Lancaster would rest on its shoulders. The Wars of the Roses went absolutely horribly for the House of Lancaster, at least at first. By 1483, every single male heir had perished in the conflict. Well, everyone but our pal, Henry Tutter. Though we'd gone over how laughably weak his claim to the throne was. He was all the Lancastrians had left. His odds were slim, but if Lancaster wanted to take back the throne, he was their only shot. Then, after the infamous events of 1483, his chances got a whole lot better. It seemed to just about everyone in England that the Wars of the Roses had long since concluded. But they didn't take Richard III into account. When Edward IV passed, his brother Richard did the unthinkable. He stole the throne from Edward's children, the rightful heirs. He locked the boys in the Tower of London and became King Richard III. His nephews were never seen or heard from again. Many in England, loyal to Edward, despised Richard III for his treachery. Nobles throughout the kingdom were ready to rise up and take the throne back from this new usurper king. Henry VIII hadn't seen his mother in over a decade, but that doesn't mean she forgot about him. Margaret Bow may have remarried a Yorkist to save her own skin, but she was still a Lancaster at heart. She actively promoted the idea that her son Henry, the last remaining Lancastrian claimant to the throne, might take the throne from Richard III. She even had an utterly brilliant plan to make it happen. The Lancastrians hated Richard III, and anyone who liked his older brother hated him too. And Margaret of Beaufort saw an opportunity there. She had Henry VIII pledged to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward's daughter. It was the best of both worlds. Henry of Lancaster and Elizabeth of York became king and queen, uniting the two houses and finally putting the Wars of the Roses to rest. Though they'd never met, Henry pledged to marry Elizabeth of York when he returned to England. It was a good plan, but there was one major obstacle in the way. His name was Richard. Richard III was one of the most ruthless men in history, and he wasn't about to let some punk come in and take his throne. The first time Henry tried to land in England, Richard was there waiting for him. The invasion fell apart immediately. Henry's biggest ally, the Duke of Buckingham, was captured and executed, and Henry had to flee back to France. Not long after that first disastrous invasion, Henry tried again. This time, he successfully landed in Wales with his uncle Jasper and a small force of men. As he marched westwards toward England, he attracted more supporters. He was Welsh, after all. By the time he reached England, he'd amassed a measly force of about 6,000 men. It likely wasn't nearly enough to take on Richard III, but it was all Henry had. One way or another, the Wars of the Roses were about to end for good. When Henry VIII met Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, things did not look good. Richard's men vastly outnumbered Henry's. Plus, Richard had a whole second force led by the Earl of Northumberland. And on top of that, Richard III was a battle-hardened warrior, whereas the youthful Henry had never seen combat. Even when Henry's force seemed to gain an advantage, Richard wasn't scared. He simply singled to the Northumberland to join the fighting. And that's where things got interesting. For reasons that remain mysterious to this day, the Earl of Northumberland never joined the Battle of Bosworth Field. Instead, he left Richard and Henry to duke it out on their own. When Richard realized that help was not coming, he decided he had to end the battle immediately, or else risk losing everything. He gazed out across the fray and spotted young Henry Tutter's banner waving nearby. Richard gathered his bodyguard and charged straight at the banner. He wanted to eliminate his rival personally, and he got extremely close to doing it. With the battle going sideways, Richard knew the fastest way to end it was to slay Henry himself. But while Henry was nowhere near the warrior that Richard was, he was still as devious as he's ever been. He saw Richard charging his way and jumped off his horse to hide among his men. Richard tore through Henry's bodyguard, slaying his standard-bearer. Richard fought like a man possessed. Then he finally found who he was looking for, the terrified Henry Tutter. All but helpless, Richard III fought himself to within a sword's length of Henry Tutter. Just a few steps more, and the entire Tutter dynasty would be erased from history. But Henry's men recovered from Richard's charge, surrounded their ward, and slowly pushed back the hated king. Richard, who'd been so close, found himself further and further away from his quarry. From the safety of his ring of bodyguards, Henry Tudor watched Richard III fade into the distance. Then he disappeared entirely. Still, Richard III refused to yield. He gathered his remaining men around him and roared, "God forbid that I retreat one step. I will either win the battle as king or die as one." And he did just that. One by one, Henry Tudor's forces slew Richard's bodyguard. Richard's bannerman lost the use of his legs, but he still kept the York banner aloft until one of Henry's men ran him through. Richard's close friends and greatest warriors were dispatched one by one until only the king remained. Still, Richard fought on, allegedly crying a single word over and over: treason. It didn't matter. Henry's men surrounded him, and one of them slammered a hellbird into the king's helmet so hard it crushed his skull. The battle was over. Against all odds, Henry Tudor had won, or should we say, King Henry the Eighth of England, father of the Tudor dynasty. Yet, though the fighting had stopped, Henry the Eighth was just getting started. Henry's first act as the King of England was subtly brilliant. He declared himself king by right of conquest, retroactively dated to August 21st, 1485, the day before the Battle of Bosworth Field. That meant anyone who had fought against Henry at the battle was technically guilty of treason. However, Henry said that he would pardon anyone who swore fealty to him, allowing them to keep their lands and their titles. Just like that, Henry VIII got the vast majority of his enemies to pledge themselves to him. But once that was done, he still had a promise to deliver on. With his throne secure, Henry made good on his pledge and married Elizabeth of York, finally uniting the houses of Lancaster and York. You didn't forget about Henry's scheming mother, Margaret, did you? Credit where credit is due. Margaret Booth, once a destitute 13-year-old widow with an infant son, had manipulated events behind the scenes until that boy was the king of freaking England. However, now that she'd succeeded, she wasn't about to play second fiddle to some tart Elizabeth. Margaret made a point of wearing clothes that were every bit as fine as Elizabeth's, and only ever walked a half-step behind the Queen. I'm sure Henry felt amazing reuniting with his mother after 14 years, and as a king no less. But Henry might have forgotten just how hands-on his mother could be. Especially in the early days of his reign, Henry's mother had a say on nearly all the matters of the English court. Her influence was so overt that even foreign visitors noted just how much power the king's mother had. She also rarely left her son's side. I hope she gave him a little privacy, because now that Henry's throne was secure, he had one thing on his mind: making babies. Henry knew that a crown claimed by conquest was never truly secure. If you took the throne by force, what's stopping someone else from doing the same to you? So, the first order of business was to have a son. That way, if anything happened to him, he at least had an heir. Henry named his firstborn son Arthur. He hoped that little Arthur would carry on his name, and helped turn the Tudors into one of England's greatest dynasties. Henry VII was a deeply paranoid man. In 1490, a young man appeared claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the princes in the Tower from whom Richard III had stolen the throne all those years ago. If he was who he claimed he was, he certainly had a better claim to the throne than Henry VII. This new rival made a deal with the King of Scotland and planned an invasion on England. Richard of Shrewsbury landed at Cornwall with a few thousand troops to try and take Henry VII's throne. But there would be no Cinderella upset this time. Henry's troops quickly dealt with his new force and captured the mysterious prince. Prince Arthur was the apple of his father's eye. He was kind, gentle, and allegedly extremely handsome. He represented the future of the Tudors, and both Henry and Elizabeth doted on the delicate boy. He was also their most valuable bargaining chip when it came to political alliances. So, the king and queen set about finding a wife for their son. After both the Wars of the Roses and the 100 Years' War, England needed allies. France was obviously out of the question. So Henry looked to Spain. He suggested that his son Arthur marry the Spanish king's daughter, Catherine of Aragon. At first, it seemed like Arthur and Catherine had a fairy tale romance. Arthur was a hopeless romantic, and he wrote gushing love letters to his bride-to-be, who returned them in kind. But they were both mere teenagers, and had to wait until they came of age before they could actually marry. Then in 1501, Arthur turned 15, and the time had finally come. Both groom and bride were ecstatic, if only they'd known what was coming. Clad in luxurious white satin, Prince Arthur and Princess Catherine married in St. Paul's Cathedral in late 1501. It was an extravagant affair with much fanfare and a choir of children serenading the new couple. But when night fell, the evening took a twisted turn. No royal wedding was complete without a bedding ceremony. Such bedding ceremonies were meant to prove the consummation of the marriage. Henry and Elizabeth's final child, Catherine, passed just days after her birth, but the parents didn't have time to mourn for her. Elizabeth had contracted a postpartum infection and was barely clinging to life. She hung on for 9 agonizing days, but there was no recovering this time. Elizabeth of York passed on February 11, 1503, less than a year after Arthur. These 2 losses in quick succession broke Henry for good, and his reign entered a dark new era. With his wife gone now, Henry VIII cared about only 2 things: money and power. Henry resorted to the most ruthless methods imaginable to extort every last penny out of his people. I doubt Elizabeth of York would have liked the man her husband became, but she was gone. That's probably a good thing, though, because that way she never had to see who he planned to marry next. Between losing his son and wife, Henry VIII probably didn't have much time to think about the Spanish princess wandering his court. Catherine of Aragon, his son's teenaged widow, was still kicking around England, but with Prince Arthur gone, Henry's Spanish alliance was in jeopardy. So he came up with a disturbing plan to save it. Henry was now a widower, and his young daughter-in-law a widow. He still wanted someone in his family married to her to ensure a Spanish alliance. Do you see where this is going? For a time, Henry planned to marry Catherine of Aragon himself, despite the fact that she was decades younger than him and his own son's widow. Henry married Catherine of Aragon to his son, but his advisors still thought he needed a new queen. They presented several excellent diplomatic candidates, such as the Queen of Castile and the Duchess of Savoy. Eventually, he settled on Queen Joanna of Naples. He sent his attendants to Naples to report on her physical suitability, but everyone knew Henry's heart wasn't in it. His attendants had only to look at his description of his ideal queen to know that. When Henry VIII sent ambassadors to check out Joanna of Naples, he described what he was looking for, and it was heartbreaking. His letter simply described his departed wife, Elizabeth of York, to a T. Clearly, Henry wasn't over her, and he never would be. He simply couldn't go through with marrying Joanna. In fact, he never remarried at all. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to Keep Exploring with Us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factate, for more